Today, I bring to you the 2024 suspense drama series, Constellations. In the middle of the night, a mother and daughter travel through a snowstorm. As a frantic woman's call for help comes on the radio, the situation grows dire. Their cabin is now on fire.
What's she saying?
She's saying,
When's Daddy coming?
The mother takes a glance at her daughter through the rearview mirror and stays silent. A police car appears behind them. The mother looks at the glowing object in the passenger seat and seems to grow tense. Fortunately, the police car just passes by, relieving her stress.
What's happened to Daddy?
They arrive at a small cabin in the north of Sweden. The daughter shows curiosity toward a painting in the room. The mother asks her to go to sleep, so the daughter picks up her tablet and plays a bedtime story. The main character in the story is Jo, the mother, who happens to be an astronaut at the European Space Agency. This video explaining cosmic knowledge has accompanied her through countless sleepless nights. Jo hides the bag containing the glowing object in the cabin outside. Just then, a call for help from her daughter comes from the forest. She rushes back into the cabin after a moment of confusion, only to find her daughter has fallen asleep. Jo, holding a lantern, comes outside. The call for help from her daughter comes again from the distance. She takes a glance at the back of the cabin, then heads towards the direction of the voice. Fast forward 5 months ago, Jo was at the International Space Station, 460 kilometers above the Earth's surface, video calling Alice, her daughter. Today, it's her turn to perform an external inspection task with her partner. Jo shows her lettuce grown inside the space station, as well as a cold atom experiment that Paul is carrying out remotely with a lab in California. Jo only knows that it is an exploration of a new state of matter but can't explain the specific principle. As Jo is waving at her daughter with Earth as the backdrop, Paul activates the cold atom device. Seconds later, a tremendous alarm sounds, and the entire space station's signal breaks down into chaos. It appears to be hit by something, causing a rupture in the outer wall. In the chaos, Paul's arm was caught by a door, and Jo was also flung off by something. After an unknown passage of time, the signal finally restores. The ground control immediately orders all crew members to gather at the Union 1 escape capsule. They initiate emergency protocols, preparing for evacuation. However, Jo found that the path to the Union 1 was blocked by the fire. She had to gather with her partners in the Horizon experimental cabin. The pressurizing system of the space station was shut off before anyone could return, revealing that Paul's arm was severely bleeding from being caught by a door. The control center warned that the station was facing a serious lack of oxygen and pressure. They urged everyone to check the life support systems and the escape pods as soon as possible. After an inspection, they found that the life support system and Union 1 escape pod were destroyed. Only Union 2 escape pod was operable, but with only 3 seats in the Union 2 and 5 people on board. They discussed that the only option for injured Paul was amputation, or he would be immobilized and wait for death. Jo and Ilya, however, were chosen for an even more daunting task. They needed to leave the cabin to repair life support systems and assess the damage to Union 1. Meanwhile, in California lab, Henry received partial data of the cold atom experiment. The cold atoms were successfully separated seconds before the accident on the space station. He immediately contacted the control center of the European Space Agency, insisting that this was a major discovery, a state of matter that can only exist in zero-gravity environment. He urged that even if the astronauts evacuated the space station, they must bring back the cold atom device, wearing spacesuits. Jo and Ilya inspected the life support system. They found that the electrical equipment and oxygen supply cables were damaged and could not be repaired. The control center ordered Ilya to repair Union 1 escape pod, while Jo was to repair the life support system. The camera systems were completely destroyed and could not offer any technical support. They had to rely on themselves. Jo found that the life support system had been completely destroyed by an unidentified object. After opening the broken part, Jo found an orange object inside. When she vigorously pulled at the object, to her horror, she discovered a body that seemed to be dead for quite a long time. She tried to grab hold of the body, but the tethering cable was too short. She had to watch helplessly as the body drifted into space. Ilya was immediately dispatched by the control center to inspect the scene. He was horrified to see Jo gasping for air in shock. She believed that what she saw was a female corpse dressed in a former USSR astronaut suit. On hearing this, a female leader in the Russian Space Agency showed a startled look. Soon, bad news came from inside the space station. Paul had died from massive blood loss. Despite resuscitation efforts, they were not able to revive him. Now that there was damage to the life support systems, they had no choice but to evacuate. The space agency ordered the three of them to take Union 1 escape pod back to Earth, leaving one person behind to repair Union 1's damaged power system using the space station's backup battery. Since the remaining life support system could only support one person's survival, they all understood that the survival prospect of the one staying behind was negligible. Caught in this dilemma, Joe, the highest official left after Paul's death, took charge and started issuing orders. She told the others to go ahead, deciding to stay behind. After setting the Union 2 return orbit and detaching from the space station, Joe quietly bid farewell to her teammates as she watched the escape pod disappear into the distance. The remaining oxygen in the space station was only enough for her to survive 19 hours. To return to Earth and reunite with her family, Joe immediately began to repair the Union 1 escape pod. Despite having enough oxygen to breathe in the escape pod, its power system was damaged and there wasn't sufficient power to take her back to Earth. She needed to stock up the escape pod with enough supplies for 24 hours and replace its battery with others from the station. For maximum efficiency, the International Space Station would supply her with oxygen and power every 45 minutes for the repair process. So Joe wasted no time in utilizing the remaining 19 hours to start the repair work. Meanwhile, the three astronauts on Union 2 successfully returned to Earth. Hearing this was a moment of joy for Joe. However, the control center arranged another task for her. She was instructed to take the new data of the cold atom experiment pile from another cabin. This undoubtedly made her escape even more difficult. Joe expressed her uncertainty on whether she had enough time. She said she would get the equipment if she had time. Her will to survive led Joe to successfully repair the battery system around the 15th hour. At this moment, a strange knocking sound came from the space station's hatch. But apart from Paul's dead body, she was the only living person on the station. Confused, Joe opened the hatch to check but saw nothing. The knocking sound echoed again from nearby. Following the noise, she was led to the cold atom device. A bizarre scene unfolded in front of Joe. She found herself in a wide hallway. The knocking sound was coming from the room at the end. Joe removed her breathing mask and moved towards it, discovering her daughter's bracelet hanging on the doorknob. But when she turned her head, she was back on the space station, hearing her daughter's voice calling from behind. However, she couldn't find her in the snowy land, even after searching for a long time. Strangely, her daughter's voice seemed to lead her back to the cabin. Inside the room was pitch black and the falling snow occasionally paused, then resumed. When Joe pushed open the door, she found the room covered in ice. A dead cat was lying on the floor. It seemed like it had been dead for a long time. The angel painting on the wall had transformed into a devil. A knocking sound came from upstairs. Joe went up confused and found the sound was coming from a locked closet. Her daughter's bracelet was also hanging on the closet door handle. When she unlocked it, she found her daughter hiding inside. Alice, nearly frozen stiff, clung tightly to her mother, asking where she'd been for all this time. Joe could only recall that she seemed to have been gone for only about half an hour. Joe woke up finding it hard to breathe, having lost contact with the space agency's control center. She checked her watch and realized that several hours had passed and the remaining oxygen in the space station was scarce. As she was changing the last battery, a piece of white cloth appeared out of nowhere. Joe looked puzzledly towards where it came from. Paul's corpse, which was there, had suddenly opened its eyes. She went into the escape pod and closely inspected Paul, even leaning in to listen for a heartbeat or breath. Once she confirmed that Paul truly was dead, she closed his eyes. While Joe was changing batteries and talking to herself, she heard a strange noise again. So, she replayed the recording.
Stop breathing, Joe. You stay in destiny.
The voice in the recording was Paul, who passed away. She unlatched the flashlight and went to the escape pod, and found a severed arm appeared outside the hatch. Joe opened the hatch door and entered the space station. This was where Paul's amputation had taken place, and there were still his bloodstains on the wall. Joe hesitantly grabbed onto Paul's floating severed arm. The next second, Paul's figure suddenly appeared before her eyes. Startled, Joe immediately let go, and the figure of Paul disappeared once again. Finally, the battery system of the escape pod was repaired. Joe started the evacuation procedure as per the instructions of the space agency. The first step was to input the return orbit parameter. As the communication was interrupted, she tried to input the parameters from when her friends left yesterday. but was notified that the data had expired. Joe angrily slapped the control panel and surprisingly, it skipped the step and entered the 90 minutes re-entry procedure. However, to successfully land, the orbit parameter was still needed. Joe had to start calculating on her own and finally finished just in time. Then she remembered the task from NASA to retrieve the pile data from the cold atom experiment lab. She went to the space station to remove the device and input the calculated return orbit argument into the escape pod. Joe had no idea if she could successfully return to Earth. She recorded her sentimental last words to her husband and daughter and threw the tablet back to the space station. Then she closed the escape pod door, put on her spacesuit and waited for the initiating of the return journey. However, the final step encountered a hinge bolt malfunction. It seemed that the interface was jammed. Joe checked the manual of the escape pod. It stated that if a hinge bolt malfunction occurred, the pod needed to be launched from another hatch door on the space station. It meant that 2 astronauts were needed for this operation. But where could she find a second person to help her press the launch button in the station? She was so close to returning to Earth yet so far. As the countdown of the space station's life support system began, all personnel stood up in silence. The escape pod failed to detach, indicating Joe's escape plan had failed. Just then, a shadow suddenly appeared inside the space station. To Joe's surprise, the hinge bolt malfunction was resolved. The escape pod successfully detached from the space station. Suspiciously, she peered out the window at the station, unable to believe her eyes for a moment. There was a figure in the window of the station, watching her. It wasn't until 3 hours later, when Union 1's escape pod entered the atmosphere, that ground control detected it. But communication was still impossible. Joe was using a ballistic landing. Therefore, the predicted touchdown point could be anywhere within a 300-kilometer radius. The space agency immediately contacted surrounding countries near the possible landing site, aiming to find the escape pod's landing site as quickly as possible. Joe's escape pod eventually landed in a desert on the Russian border. The shock of landing caused her to pass out. After an unknown amount of time, she finally woke up. She found herself in severe pain. Joe endured the pain, unbuckled her seatbelt and cried with joy at the sight of the outside world, realizing she finally made it back to Earth. After opening the hatch, Joe greedily inhaled the long-missed air, when unexpectedly, a wild wolf approached the escape pod. Just as Joe, who escaped death and managed to return to Earth, was about to be attacked by the wolf, a gunshot frightened the animal away. A group of Russian soldiers and space agency staff arrived and rescued her. Her husband and daughter also arrived by helicopter. The 3 of them hugged each other, speaking caring words. When Henry was checking the data of the cold atom device, he didn't notice the device emitting a blue light. Inside the helicopter a moment ago, Alice was holding her mother's hand. In an instant, everyone around her disappeared, leaving her alone. The same scene happened before Joe's eyes as well. She looked out the window in confusion. However, the next moment everything returned to normal. Her daughter and husband were all there. Joe thought she was only hallucinating. Unaware, she closed her eyes and leaned against the window. Her husband and daughter exchanged a glance filled with oddity. Fast forward 5 months. Joe was running a bath in their cabin in the snowy woods. She put almost frozen Alice into the tub. While she was smelling Alice's aroma, she suddenly said something strange.
You smell like you again.
The hot water in the heater ran out. Joe was preparing to go to the kitchen to heat some water, and upon seeing the reflection in the window, noticed a figure sleeping on the bed, holding up the oil lamp to check. It appeared to be her daughter, Alice. Joe turned her head towards the bathroom. Alice was in the tub, complaining that she was cold. As Joe was about to go over, she heard her daughter's call from behind. Confused, Joe returned to the bathroom only to find the tub was empty. The Alice who was just bathing has vanished. She called out her daughter's name loudly, which puzzled Alice wearing her pajamas. Joe went up and hugged Alice. Smelling her, she noticed Alice's scent was different from her daughter's. However, Alice claimed she didn't see anything. Joe told her to get dressed right away. Grabbing the cold atom device from the cabin in haste, she gestured to Alice to follow her quickly.
Freeze to death! We're gonna find her! Who? The other you!
Having survived a near-death experience, Joe was interviewed by many media outlets. She spoke of the space station incident originating from an unidentified object's collision. The reporters were confused as the space station had a system to detect space debris. The senior official of the space agency intervened upon hearing Joe mention that it was too late when they heard the alarm system. He stated that report on the cause of the incident couldn't be divulged until the investigation was over. During recovery, the doctor gave Joe some red and yellow capsules, stating that these vitamins are required for all astronauts returning to Earth. Joe and her family visited Paul's home to express their regret. The next day, Joe and other space station astronauts were summoned by the space agency.
Erica. He was a great man. I'm so sorry. Frida is my name.
They started displaying footage of the incident. Joe noticed some discrepancies with her memory. She didn't hear any alarms in the video, but she clearly remembered hearing them at that time. However, the other three claimed they did not hear any alarms. In fact, one of them had even reviewed the system report, showing that the alarm never went off. Hence, the American astronaut who provided the space debris monitoring technology bore full responsibility. Joe later went outside to check the secondary life support system. Her camera malfunctioned, so no one saw the colliding object. Joe confirmed that it was a corpse, a human female wearing a Soviet spacesuit. The body was desiccated and mummified. Irene raised objections again. It's been 32 years since the Soviet Union collapsed. A space mummy remaining in space for that long and managing to destroy the International Space Station, it's just not plausible. She presented images of orange garbage bags discarded by space station astronauts, suggesting that Joe may have mistaken these for a Soviet suit under hypoxia-induced delusion. To date, Russia has decrypted all Soviet astronautic data. They know everyone who has been to space, and no records have been found about astronauts missing in space. After the meeting, the senior official found Joe speaking privately. He expressed that it would not be beneficial if the focus remained on whether she was hypoxic at the time. Others would continue trying to prove that she was lying, because they did not want to admit that the collision could have been caused by their debris. The senior official sighed and appeared helpless. He suddenly reached out his hand to touch her face. Joe immediately dodged, questioning his motives with confusion. He, unexpectedly, looked more confused than she did, gazing at Joe for a long time. "Joe, I don't know what's going on with you. Please sort out your statements," he said. Joe also noticed some abnormalities with her husband, Magnus, and daughter, Alice. When she complimented Magnus' hairstyle, he seemed utterly surprised. Whenever Alice encountered a problem, she always sought help from her father rather than herself. Joe didn't know what happened, but she felt like she was not herself anymore. When Magnus helped her undress her spacesuit, Joe leaned in and kissed him. On the other side, Henry was reading the cold atom device data in the lab, but found no record of successful separation. His female assistant failed to detect any condensate, only some residues, thinking that the matter could have only survived for a brief moment in space before disappearing. However, Henry firmly believed that what he saw after the escape pod landing and what Paul saw during the experiment at the International Space Station were the same. Even if it has disappeared now, it doesn't prove that the matter didn't exist. Henry continued his research into the data at night. The screen showed the cold atom undergoing a separation process again, but when he picked up his phone to capture it, the images on the phone screen differed vastly from what was displayed on the computer screen. Henry had no choice but to draw the cold atom separation phenomenon on paper. The next day, his female assistant saw this drawing and jokingly said that hand sketching wouldn't get him a Nobel Prize. Henry explained that it is his 35 years of hard work, wondering why no one believes him, being able to see what others can't. The only explanation Henry could think of is the observer's effect, unless it is his hallucination. Meanwhile, Alice and Paul's daughter were playing hide and seek. Alice was upset seeing the other girl stomping on her beloved rabbit toy in the pond. Alice ran out trying to stop her, but the girl and the rabbit toy instantly disappeared. Alice didn't know what was going on. She left the room she was hiding in, found the girl, and confronted her about what she did to her rabbit toy, but the girl claimed she didn't do anything. Their argument escalated, and they parted on bad terms. Henry found Alice in the field, and they started discussing his research on quantum physics. For a long time, mankind has used classical physics as the benchmark. It is the basic rule for measuring and predicting various things. Not until the emergence of Einstein and others, research began on invisible micromatter, atomic particles, and waveforms. Since then, many theories of classical physics have been overthrown, such as a single particle can exist in two different states. In one world, the particle is black, while in another world, it is white. Between these two worlds exists a presupposed space where the particle is both black and white. It fluctuates between black and white until an observer appears. Though it sounds incredible, it indeed exists in reality. He created a machine and sent it to space, hoping to solve this problem. but it seems that they don't want to be discovered. Jo and her husband asked their own about any changes, with Magnus saying her gaze upon him had changed indeed. Just then, the doorbell rang. Henry brought their daughter back. He was there to thank Jo for managing to bring back the cold ion device amid the time crunch during her escape. Not exactly something she had to do. During their handshake, Jo felt something unusual. Henry was part of the Apollo moon landing crew. Before he left, he gave Jo a piece of advice: every astronaut who has been to outer space needs to prioritize their own security. The next day, Jo admitted she might have misseen something at the Incident Responsibility Inspection meeting. It could have just been a garbage bag. Returning to their home in Cologne, Germany, Jo noticed a blue car in the yard. When she asked her husband if he had bought a new car since she remembered it being red, he appeared confused, insisting it had always been blue. Henry attended an astronaut interview program on a cruise ship. The host was critical of the Apollo moon landing project, accusing it of recklessness. The radiation levels between Earth and the moon are extremely high. The ship has weak thickness, making it easy for astronauts to contract severe radiation sickness. Henry explained that during their travels through the Van Allen radiation belt, the speed was as fast as 16,000 kilometers per hour. Time was short enough to prevent human exposure to radioactive particles. With his presence there as the best proof. Had he known the host would ask such questions, he might have thrown him off the ship. In the face of many space fans, Henry admitted that he wasn't on Apollo 11, so he didn't know if they actually landed on the moon. However, he confirmed that his Apollo 18 landed successfully. This was all written in his biography. Yet, the host next to him declared his book full of fallacies and worthless. Even the name of his first dog was wrong in the book. He figured someone concocted a story for Henry, or his memory was unreliable. After the interview, Henry was furious. He recalled his last night with Irene before leaving Russia. She spoke of her frequent dreams about space, dreams about orbiting the Earth endlessly. Henry, however, suspected she was hiding something. Why would she adamantly deny at the accident investigation meeting that the object crashing into the space station was a cosmonaut corpse? Irene, instead of answering, told him that she was dying from late-stage lymphoma. This was their last time drinking together, so they should avoid unpleasant topics. The host found Henry again on the cruise ship. During the Apollo era, due to technical issues, the returning space vehicles often missed their designated landing spots by quite a distance. Only Henry had successfully managed to land an unmanned cabin just 457 meters away from a U.S. aircraft carrier. Henry laughed, stating that there were 3 people in the cabin, not just him. It's just that they died, and he was fortunate to have survived. The host, an ex-detective for 30 years, said that his suspicions were based on facts, not baseless assumptions. Henry confessed that there were some blanks in his memory and that indeed, he couldn't recall some things. He was certain that he had fixed all the malfunctions on Apollo 18 before returning. His 2 partners were alive before he passed out from cabin depressurization. He had no idea why they died all of a sudden. The host continued to label Henry as a liar who couldn't cover up his lies, which brought back the image of the dried-up corpse of Irene in his mind. Enraged, he pushed the host off the cruise ship into the sea. What secrets were these astronauts hiding? Henry wondered. Fast forward 5 months. It was a snowy night in Sweden. Alice was following her mother, continually moving forward in the blizzard. She left beads from her bracelet as markers on her path. Jo urged her to speed up, saying that there was a cabin out there like theirs, but it was not their real cabin. After walking for a while, Alice saw her markers on the snow again. She called her mother, thinking that there was no cabin out there. She figured that people often see illusions when they are in distress. Those who've been to outer space also see such illusions. Jo walked up to her with a lamp in her hand.
I don't think you're my daughter. If I'm not, then who are you? What have you done to my mummy?
Once back home, Jo found the cabinets were different from before. She thought it was Magnus refurbishing the house during her year in space, but he denied it, saying it had always been like this. Magnus also noticed some changes in his wife after she came back from space. He admitted that their relationship was in a pretty bad state when she left. He didn't even look at her when saying goodbye. Yet, Jo remembered that she loved her husband and would never do that. Jo walked up to her husband and caressed his face.
Of course I love you.
That night, Jo dreamt about the space station again. She got up to get water from the kitchen and saw a picture. It was a picture of her and her daughter playing the piano, but Jo clearly remembered that she didn't know how to play the piano. The next day, Jo found her husband to be absent-minded. After inquiring, it turned out that he suspected she had more than a working relationship with Frederick. Surprised, Jo immediately denied it and swore to her husband that she had never crossed the line with Frederick. Seeing the honesty in his wife's eyes, Magnus confessed his faults. During Joe's trip to space, he met a woman, but they just went out for drinks and nothing happened. Seeing Joe's alteration in expression, Magnus quickly explained he thought Joe was going to leave him at that time. The gossip outside made him believe that her relationship with Frederick was not just professional, and she might ask for a divorce when she returned from space. Jo was pretty upset. She had endured a life-threatening accident in space and her only thought was to return home to her husband and daughter. Just then, the daughter started yelling for her father. Jo sought the help of the agency's psychiatrist, revealing that some things seemed different from her memories after returning from space. Jo was having visions of the deceased Paul from the space station, and sometimes she even felt like she was still at the International Space Station. The doctor explained these were likely symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder. The accident on the space station was indeed quite dangerous. She was scared for her life and had to face the death of her friend. Having experienced such severe psychological trauma, it was no surprise that the memories would still be triggered even now back on Earth. The doctor prescribed some antidepressant pills which had a calming effect and could alleviate her symptoms. Jo left with the medication and ran into Henry. He invited her to his lab and asked if she had noticed any anomalies in space. He had two friends on Gemini 4, who both claimed to have smelled something burning and heard dog barks in space. A newspaper clipping about the crew of Apollo 7 seeing angels was seen on his desk. While Henry was adjusting the cold ion instrument, Jo suddenly felt a sharp pain in her left eye. But a few seconds later, everything was back to normal. She looked at the cold ion instrument she brought back from the space station, and various images appeared before her eyes. A few days later, Jo and her husband were called to Alice's school. Alice was often talking about death and the supernatural, and often hid in the closet. The teacher thought it was because Jo's job kept her away from Alice. After going back home, Alice hid in the cabinet again. Jo saw a colorful necklace on the cabinet door and was reminded of the visions she had on the space station.
Baby, don't shut me out.
I'm not.
You're not happy I'm back?
I'm just a little bit disappointed. I thought it would be different.
Meanwhile, Henry's cold ion experiment failed to yield data. His lab was set to close. He approached investors, attempting to persuade them to continue the funding. He explained that on the gas laser, after the laser is turned off, a superposed state forms, creating two black oscillatory waves side by side. He showed them the observed results from the space station, which displayed interference patterns that shouldn't have been there. But back on Earth, there were no data. The data was there in plain light, but only he could see it. As if the data didn't want to be found by others, the investor concluded that a portal to another universe was impossible, suggesting that what was seen at the space station might be an error. Henry knew he couldn't provide evidence. They couldn't go back to space for another test in a short time. He theorized that the experiment could be observed in different ways, one not shown on the screen, but appearing directly in the observer's mind. As Henry was questioning the reality of the world, so was Jo. She sat at the piano and began to follow the sheet music, attempting to play despite her memory informing her she had never learned. But after the initial stiffness, she was horrified to find herself becoming increasingly skilled, as if she had played it 1,000 times before. Jo took out the calming medication the doctor had prescribed from its box. Suddenly feeling a sense of déjà vu, she found the vitamin capsules that the nurse had given her when she returned to Earth, and they looked exactly the same. Jo poured the powders from the capsules and tasted them. They also tasted the same. Jo rushed to the aerospace agency overnight. On her way, she heard Henry in a video call in his office.
I'm an autonomous human being. I don't need anyone's permission to be anywhere. God damn it. I want us to agree on what's causing this. Convince me that I am not going insane.
Ignoring that, she headed straight to the laboratory. She put both drugs into the detection instrument, finally confirming that they were the same sedative. Why would the aerospace agency deceive her into believing it was a vitamin? Leaving, she saw two cleaners across the room. As she was wondering how to explain why she was there in the middle of the night, they seemed not to see her and walked away. Talking amongst themselves, Jo went to the infirmary to check the patient records on the doctor's computer. It was the same for the 3 people who returned to Earth before her, but when it was her turn, it was marked as vitamin B. So, she continued checking the medication records of other astronauts. She found that most were given vitamin A, and the few who were given vitamin B all had hallucinations in space. This included the astronaut Henry spoke of, who claimed to see angels. Just as she was wondering, two janitors suddenly came in to clean, still ignoring Joe. She asked them in puzzlement, but got no response.
Guys, stop it! Hello!
The next moment, the room was calm again, as if the janitors had never been there. As Joe left, she passed Henry's office again.
Excuse me, Henry.
On Henry's screen was the image of him pushing the host off a ship at sea, who was also the brother of Henry. They looked identical, so please don't mind that I didn't distinguish them before, but it doesn't rule out the possibility that I was right. They may not be brothers after all. Henry glanced at Joe,
Curiosity killed the cat.
whose words were meant for his brother or Joe. We don't know, but Joe's fear intensified. The next day, Frederick found Joe and brought up their agreement to join Musk's Starlink together in the US once their contracts expired. Of course, Joe had no idea what he was talking about. Her cool response made Frederick think she had changed. As Joe was giving a space knowledge talk at her daughter's school, a woman's intuition told her something was off between her husband and the female teacher. As Joe and her husband were arguing and driving home, the music her daughter was playing triggered pain in Joe's left eye again. She started hallucinating as if she was on the space station, which almost led to a car accident. Frederick came home to comfort her and suggested it was a stress response from the space accident and she might need treatment for a while. When Magnus inquired about their relationship, Frederick did not deny it. He believed Joe would leave and go with him, unaware that Joe in front of him did not love him. Magnus remembered Joe's swear, believing she had lied.
Maybe this isn't the same place that I left.
It's you that's different. It's exactly the same, Joe.
As Joe vented her grievances in fury, she suddenly saw an envelope from a Danish observatory, containing 2 tapes and a letter. Joe found a tape recorder and began to play the recordings. She heard her own distress call from the space station. The second recording was dated November 23, 1967, and seemed to report a tragic accident in space leading to the death of a female astronaut. The voices in the recording were just as distorted and vague. At the same time, when their daughter Alice woke up to find only her father in her room, she went to the living room to find Joe and instead saw that it had become a funeral parlor, with another version of herself, and the deceased Paul was present. Her scream prompted her parents to whisk her into the closet. Thinking she would calm down there, Joe argued there was something wrong with that, but the daughter sided with her father. Joe told her husband that somebody schemed to get her to take antipsychotics to deny the truth she saw in space. She needed to find out why they were doing that, but her husband considered Joe really insane and prepared to call Frederick to send her for treatment. During the argument, Joe pushed her husband, causing him to hit his head on the piano and pass out. Fast forward 5 months to Sweden in the snow. Alice was once again complaining about the weather, but this time, accompanying her was Magnus instead. They arrived back at the forest cabin again. The painting on the wall of the cabin had changed once again. In an argument, Joe pushed her husband, causing him to fall backward and knock his head on the piano, knocking him out. After calling an ambulance, she ushered her daughter out of the closet and left the house. First, she drove to the aerospace agency, to Henry's office, and checked the recordings of the space station from his computer.
It's looking for a new state of matter. Only 84.
Within them were the sounds of her video call with her daughter. Joe suspected that the cold atom experiment may have been linked to her experiences, so she packed the cold atom device into her bag and took it with her. On her way, she contacted her former Russian colleague from the space station, Ilya. After returning to Earth, the aerospace agency gave them all vitamins. Joe was given vitamin B, and Ilya and the others were given vitamin A. Upon returning to Europe, the psychiatrist diagnosed her with PTSD and prescribed her an antidepressant named Pamel. The pills looked exactly the same as vitamins, so she had them tested and found they were the same drug. Joe believed her medicine was different from theirs because she saw something that someone didn't want her to see. She heard her voice in the recordings from the Danish observatory, which meant the aerospace agency could hear her speaking when she was alone in the International Space Station. She thought the communication was interrupted and there must be a problem. Just as Joe was about to play the recording for the colleagues, Her daughter in the back seat woke up, so she asked her colleague to also analyze the medication, but to keep it confidential, Jo crossed the border into Denmark with her daughter, and at a roadside restaurant, she asked her daughter why she hid in the closet, a behavior that seemed to be linked to fear. After hesitation, Alice mentioned a name.
Thalia.
Is Thalia a person?
It scares me.
What does Thalia do? Why does it scare you?
She kind of tricks me. She tricks me into not playing.
It's a she?
So Jo asked her daughter to draw what she saw, while she contacted the Danish observatory that sent the tapes using the restaurant phone, but the old man on the other side said her delusional sister had sent them and then abruptly hung up. Jo checked the internet on her phone and found out that this sister and brother were in prison for 6 months for falsifying many tapes over the years. Jo couldn't accept this reality. If the tapes were fake, then how could she explain her experiences? She calmed her emotions and called her husband to apologize. Frederick was at her home wishing she would return soon to see a psychiatrist. Just when Jo was about to agree, her daughter handed her the finished drawing. Seeing the drawing, Jo was completely stunned. It was clearly the corpse that had collided with the space station, but she remembered not telling her daughter about it. Jo recalled that after she returned to Earth, Frederick was very concerned about whether she was taking her medicine. He must have known it was antipsychotic medication, but Frederick didn't want to answer and said they would talk when she returned. In the Russian Space Agency, Ilya confirmed his medicine was indeed vitamins after examining it, so he used his power to check the medication records for Jo. Just then, Irene found Ilya and informed her that Jo was missing. She had assaulted her husband, taken their child, and stolen a research instrument from the European Space Agency. If Ilya heard any news from Jo, she must inform Irene immediately. Jo drove with her daughter to Lake Nav Observatory on Mon Island, Denmark. An old woman greeted them. Her brother, Lauren, who suffered from dementia, kept making a fuss about calling the police. The old woman asked them not to mind. Alice saw a note with 8,787 written on it on the wall and furrowed her brows. Jo explained why they were there. She had seen the body of a female astronaut in space. That body was the reverse cause of the collision with the International Space Station, but the Aerospace Agency was trying to coerce her into lying and paint her as a madwoman to be locked in a psychiatric hospital. The old lady remembered a tape that recorded an astronaut going missing, and another tape was the conversation Jo had when she lost contact with the Aerospace Agency and was alone in space. The old woman explained that the tapes Jo mentioned were heard by her brother Lauren, including the one about seeing the astronaut's corpse on the International Space Station. Going to outer space was his dream. In 1949, his father bought a second-hand space monitoring device to record the sounds of outer space themselves. At that time, there were 6 or 7 people doing this work around the world. They were just amateurs. Jo also saw a photo of them and Henry in their younger days. Lauren remembered him. Henry visited them in 1982 to ask for the Apollo 18 tapes, which ended unpleasantly. Jo remembered that Apollo 18 had also had an accident, and Henry was the sole survivor then. The Henry who went to space was an alcoholic mess. He was completely different from the Henry now. The elderly woman began to speak of a smaller Soviet space station known as Salyut 7 in 1984. 3 astronauts observed the space station being circled by an orange glowing sphere, describing the spheres as angels in space that circled over their heads. They stared at the glow for 10 minutes until the unknown object disappeared. Initially believed to be a hallucination, but 10 days later, 3 more astronauts joined the Space Center and also saw the same phenomena. Lauren also explained that a transcript of this communication indeed exists. It was reported in the Soviet newspapers at the time. Followed by an extensive investigation, Jo felt that this may have been a ghost story that they made up. But the old woman mentioned that Jo's encounter with the deceased astronaut was also another ghost story brought back from space. For a long time, they heard some chaotic static. Some recordings were very clear. Usually, the static was recorded on tape and discarded. This all changed with the Apollo 18 incident. The recordings from Apollo 18 were filled with static, but Lauren believed that he heard something. Both the American Space Agency and Russia could hear the static, but they couldn't decode it. Lauren had studied techniques to discern sounds and was an expert in that field. The old woman mentioned they'd need to continue sailing for a while before they could listen to the recordings. 8 kilometers off the shore was where the sound was clearest, and they must go to a pre-line space. A space that lies between 2 domains, such as the sea, outdoor space. Before long, the woman started playing a tape recorded on November 23, 1967. It concerned a young female astronaut from the Russian Space Agency, whose escape pod failed on her return to Earth. This woman might have been the corpse that Joe saw. The mother and daughter initially heard noise, but gradually a woman's voice appeared. Alice suddenly became emotionally distraught and called for her to stop. The old woman mentioned that she originally thought the voice belonged to Irene from the Russian Space Agency, but later heard that she returned to Earth safely. She asked Joe what she wanted to listen to next. The recordings from Apollo 8, or Paul's recordings. Joe and Alice were confused because they thought Paul had died, but the old woman said that she and her brother had heard his voice, and they were puzzled as to why Joe had returned unscathed and instead, it was Paul who had died. Fear of the unknown resulted in Joe putting a halt to the playback of the tape. The old woman explained that to date, 500 people have been to outer space. Beyond the Kármán line, they were top talent who had undergone rigorous examinations and training, not the kind who would mentally break down. The old woman believed that something was off about outer space. She wanted to play the recording to back up her words, but by then, Joe and Alice didn't want to listen any longer. On the way back, the phone Alice had stolen finally got a signal. She informed Magnus that her mother planned to take her to Wendell and the cabin. After docking, when Joe was saying goodbye to the old woman, the latter insisted on giving her the tapes. She claimed that if Joe wanted to find the truth, she must listen carefully, and all that she had said was not made up. In the European Space Agency, Frederick received the message and was just preparing to go. Henry found him and asked to join him. Frederick believed that his cold atom experiment had failed, and the lab had been shut down, so there was no need to visit. But Henry suddenly let out a strange laugh and even wet his pants in front of Frederick.
I am coming with you. I just need to change.
Henry went to the bathroom to attempt to communicate with his alternate self in a different world. He explained how his research on the cold atom device sent to space seemed to be getting worse and worse, but the alternate Henry swore to settle accounts with him.
Made you piss your pants.
In the meantime, on the way to the cabin, Joe asked about Valia mentioned by her daughter, Alice. Alice said Valia was a deceased astronaut floating around the Earth, but she could hear her. Joe asked her to play the tape from November 23, 1967. Initially, the recording was still noise, but when Alice raised the radio, something suddenly changed. A woman yelled about how the lifeboat was on fire. Upon hearing this, Alice quickly said that it was Valia. Joe made an emergency stop, snatched the recording device in terror, and found that as long as it was near the co-pilot's cold ion device, the sound would become clearer. The panicked Russian woman in the recording said that there were ghosts everywhere and that the whole world was upside down. As Joe neared the forest cabin, she found that the path was different from what she remembered. She'd been here countless times and didn't recall the two branching roads in front of her. Alice pointed to the one on the right, but Joe chose to drive straight across the frozen lake. After crossing the iced-over lake surface, they arrived at the cabin in the forest, but after getting out of the car, Joe thought she heard a cry for help coming from inside the cabin. The interior was pitch black. She dismissed it as a hallucination. During the night, Joe took out the tapes and placed them near the cold ion device. As expected, the recordings that were originally noise all become clearer. The first thing she listened to was the video call with her daughter before her accident, but Alice suddenly said that the voice in the recording was not hers.
That was not me. I don't speak Swedish. I don't call you Mama.
Meanwhile, in another world, Alice was alone in a snowstorm, searching for her mother. The story also chronicles Paul, who has traversed into another parallel universe, was conducting a cold atom experiment remotely with a laboratory in California on the Destiny International Space Station, located 460 kilometers above the Earth's surface. Just as Joe waved to her daughter with Earth in view, Paul activated the cold atom instrument. The next moment, a massive alarm sounded, and their communication with Earth was cut off. The alert was due to an unidentified object smashing into the craft and causing breach in the hull. Amid the chaos, Joe's tablet was flung away. She tried to catch it, but it was swept away by the wind. But there was a flash of white light, and she seemed to see another version of herself holding a tablet. At this point, Joe had no time to think. The hole in the window created by the impact sucked her entirely out. When Paul came and found her, her face was smashed and tape pressure had pulled her flesh into space. She was beyond saving. The cause of the accident turned out to be a corpse in an orange spacesuit. Paul returned to his lab and found that the cold atom device, which was under experiment, had vanished. Due to the damage to Soyuz 1 lifeboat, Soyuz 2 lifeboat only had 3 seats. Being of the highest rank, Paul decided to stay behind. Before his colleagues left, He told them to inform the lab about the missing cold atom device. Incapable of understanding, they left. Paul began working on repairing the damaged battery of Soyuz 1 on the space station. He suddenly heard breathing from the deceased Joe, but when he turned to look, the cloth covering her showed no signs of movement. Upon hearing the news of her mother's death, Alice refused to come out of the closet on Earth, subconsciously kicking the door. Suddenly, a flashlight beam appeared at the end of the hallway. Puzzled, Alice looked out, and as the light approached, it turned out to be her mother. "Joe!" She shouted "Mother" and ran out, only to find that there was nobody in the hallway. Communication between Paul on the space station and the ground was disrupted. While making repairs, he heard Joe's breathing again. To prevent himself from having auditory hallucinations, he switched on the tablet's audio next to Joe's body, and to his surprise, there was the sound of breathing in the recording. The next minute when Paul looked at the corpse, he was terrified. The white cloth covering Joe's head was floating. He closely inspected the body and confirmed that there were no heartbeat sounds. He covered it with the white cloth, and finally, her breathing stopped. Paul opened the previous recording, and shockingly, there was Joe's voice.
This is the third. God, we need to hurry up.
After restoring communication with the ground, Paul informed them that Joe's wound had severely ruptured. He was worried that if her body were to leave the zero-gravity environment when returning to Earth, there could be significant blood loss. In reality, he couldn't stand the sound of Joe's continual breathing. Paul moved Joe's body back into the space station. Before leaving, he held Joe's hand and apologized. However, Joe appeared to come alive before him, scaring Paul into quickly letting go. Meanwhile, Joe's body had returned to its original state. Paul thought he was hallucinating from the prolonged stay in space, so he returned to the escape pod to initiate the evacuation process. However, during the final step, an arm axis bolt malfunction occurred. The control center informed him that if there was a bolt malfunction in the lifeboat, a button on the control console inside the space station needed to be pressed to launch. This meant 2 astronauts were needed to operate it, but there was nobody else on the space station to help press the launch button. Seeing his return to Earth fail at the last hurdle, Paul furiously struck the screen panel. At that moment, a shadow suddenly appeared in the space station, and Paul was surprised to find that the bolt malfunction was resolved. The lifeboat successfully detached from the space station. As he peered through the window at the space station in bewilderment, he could hardly believe his eyes. There was someone in the space station window, watching him. After returning to Earth, Paul explained to Alice that he could not bring back her mother's body because her injuries were too severe. But when he turned to look at Joe's photograph, he found that the person in the picture had turned into himself. In the accident report meeting, Paul mentioned the cold atom experiment carried out by the Rocket Propulsion Laboratory and NASA, but everybody seemed to have no knowledge of this experiment. Paul remembered that he and Audrey were adjusting the lasers together before the accident, but she denied it. Then, in the video of the space station accident from NASA, there was no cold atom device in front of them. The new head of the Russian Space Agency mentioned that the cold atom experiment was cancelled 12 years ago. What Frederick cared about was that Paul unilaterally decided to leave Joe's body in the space station, denying her family on Earth a proper explanation. Paul also encountered strange things in daily life, such as when reviewing the video of the Apollo 18 moon landing. Only Henry returned to Earth after an accident in the lifeboat, but in his memory, Henry and the other 2 companions had returned safely. The next day, Paul went to the space agency looking for Henry, mentioning that he was the initiator of the cold atom experiment, a Nobel Prize laureate, and the director of the Rocket Propulsion Laboratory, but his superiors said that the cold atom experiment did not exist and that Henry had long left the space agency. Paul believed that the space agency was concealing something. His superiors didn't know where Henry was now and considered it to be NASA's most failed mission. On the other hand, Alice, who had lost her mother, often lost control of her emotions. One day, she suddenly saw an elderly man in a suit waving at her from a distant building. She threw the rabbit doll into the garage pond and stomped on it forcefully. Even when Paul's daughter tried to comfort her, she responded with harsh words. When she got home, she caused a mess. So, Magnus took her to a psychologist, who believed that Alice couldn't accept the reality of her mother's death. Perhaps adults don't want children to attend funerals to shield them from grief, but ceremonies can actually be necessary and helpful in alleviating the pain of losing a loved one. A few days later, Magnus held a memorial service for his wife and invited Paul and his family. Yet Paul hesitated at the door. Under his wife's constant questioning, He admitted his wrongdoings. He had fabricated lies and left Joe's body at the space station as he was overtaken by fear. Even now, he wasn't sure if Joe was still alive. At the memorial, his daughter pulled Alice over and suggested that her mother might still be alive. Alice, without waiting for a response, followed Paul's gaze, only to see another version of herself screaming in the staircase. Paul collapsed, and Alice saw her allegedly deceased mother once again. Yet no matter how Alice called out, she couldn't be heard. Magnus told his daughter that they should leave the house and spend some time in a place free of disturbances. Alice immediately suggested going to her mother's cabin. The next morning, Paul's wife woke up to find that he was gone. She couldn't reach him over the phone, so she called his superiors at the space agency. They shared that the space agency had a treatment center specifically for astronauts who feel uncomfortable after returning to Earth. A condition known as high-altitude psychosis existed, although rarely discussed. After finding Paul, they were planning on sending him for treatment. It turns out, Paul had gone to Los Angeles overnight to find Henry in this world, but the latter did not recognize him. On seeing the newspaper on the wall, Paul brought up the Apollo 18 disaster. Henry explained that 2 people died due to sudden cabin depressurization. Henry advised Paul to take medication and not overthink, asserting that his current living condition is real. Yet, Paul was persistent. He grabbed Henry by the collar, demanding the truth.
Commander Caldera, you tell me why you're here.
Why the f*** are you here?
Elsewhere, Alice and her father arrived at the cabin. She shared that she and her mother were fond of a gloomy and scary painting on the wall. Magnus had taken her there intending to help her forget the past. He tearfully held his daughter, hoping they could start a new life. Yet, Alice couldn't take her eyes away from the painting. Awoken by the sound of a car outside during the night, she went to the window to check and was startled to see her deceased mother, Joe. Stepping out of the car, she ran outside to check, but there was nothing. However, she could hear someone's footsteps. In another world, Joe turned towards the sound, but the cabin was pitch black, and she can't see anything. Alice believed what she saw was not an illusion, so she went back to her room, put on her coat, grabbed a flashlight, and ventured out alone to look for her mother. Joe heard the sound of footsteps running away, but she saw nothing. Joe and her daughter entered the cabin. Recently, she had been bothered by a severe pain in her left eye, causing her vision to blur considerably. Alice played the tape from the recorder again, confirming it was not the same as the one in her memory. Mother and daughter did not communicate in Swedish, because while Alice understood it, she couldn't speak it. In Alice's memory, her mother spoke English to her and had mentioned the cold atom experiment and that they were working on a project. Joe rubbed her sore eyes. In her memory, she had no idea about the cold atom experiment before the space station accident. She had simply brought it back to Earth on the command center's orders. Recalling that Henry mentioned that it had to do with a physical experiment, Joe explained that it was primarily used to capture quantum superposition where the same thing could exist in 2 places simultaneously. Alice found a recording from the space station the day after the accident in a bag. However, after playing it, they were shocked to hear a voice that seemingly belonged to a deceased Paul.
Erickson is so badly lacerated.
Frightened by this, Joe hurriedly turned off the recorder and suggested her daughter go to sleep early in an attempt to change the conversation.
Am I the same to you?
But Alice asked a question that was difficult for Joe to answer. Joe didn't know how to respond. At this point, they both understood that they weren't each other's original family. They decided to work together to resolve the issue. However, Alice also had the suspicion that her mother may have died in another world. Meanwhile, after Joe knocked herself out to take her daughter away, Magnus reported the incident to the police the moment he received a message from his daughter. A large group set out for the cabin. Henry and Frederick from the space agency were among them, leaving Magnus puzzled about their purpose. Joe packed the cold atom device and placed it in the outdoor shed, but she heard her daughter's voice from a distance. After a moment of confusion, Joe rushed back to the cabin, only to find her daughter already asleep. Holding a lamp, Joe stepped outside where the voice of her daughter was heard again from a distance. After glancing back at the cabin, she headed toward the sound. During her search for her mother, Alice fell. When she got up, she saw a light not far ahead, but when she got closer, she seemed to have returned to the cabin. Yet, it appeared the cabin had been abandoned for a long time. It was in complete disorder, as if it had been ravaged by a fire. The painting of the little demon that used to hang in the living room was now at the entrance. Alice searched the first floor but found no sign of her mother, so she went upstairs to look. In her haste to leave earlier, she wore just a coat over her pajamas, wanting to enter a cupboard to shelter from the wind. She was startled when a gust of wind slammed the door shut. Alice knocked on the door repeatedly and shouted for help. Following the noise, Joe finally found her and carried her frozen daughter back to their cottage. She filled the tub with hot water and placed her daughter in it. She recognized her daughter's familiar scent as she bathed her. Joe prepared to go to the kitchen to heat up some water, but as she glanced out the window, she saw her daughter sleeping in the bed. Her left eye suddenly felt a sharp pain. She turned to look at the bathroom and saw Alice in the bathtub, complaining about being cold. As she was about to go over, she heard her daughter's voice again from behind. Alice in the bathtub noticed that the water suddenly disappeared. Her calls for her mother woke Magnus from his sleep. Seeing his shivering daughter, Magnus was shocked, but Alice remained adamant that she had seen her mother outside, leading Magnus to think that it was a hallucination born out of her longing for her deceased mother. On the other hand, in another world, Joe saw that Alice, who was just in the bathtub, was missing. She called out her daughter's name loudly, much to the confusion of Alice, who was still in her pajamas. Alice made clear that she didn't see anything, and Joe instructed her to dress immediately. Rushing out of the cabin, Joe grabbed the cold atom device and beckoned for her daughter to quickly follow her.
It's too cold! She freezes, we gotta find her! Who? The other you!
Alice, who followed her mother, gradually moved forward in the blizzard, leaving her beaded bracelet as a marker. Joe urged her to speed up, pointing out that their cabin was just ahead, but it wasn't their real cabin. After a long journey, Alice saw the marker she had left on the snow. She halted her mother, asserting that there wasn't another cabin ahead, and proposed that people hallucinate when they're upset.
I don't want to hurt you. I don't think you're my daughter.
If I'm not, then who are you?
Let's find out together.
What have you done to my mummy?
Alice turned and ran, thinking her mother had lost her mind and wanting to go home to find her father.
What, Daddy? I want to go home to Daddy!
On another note, Joe, who was chasing her daughter in the blizzard, found that the Alice from the other world put on her coat and came out of the cabin to find her mother. Meanwhile, Magnus called the police for help after waking up and finding Alice missing.
Alice! Alice!
In the blizzard, Alice found the beads of the bracelet that she had thrown in the other world on the ground, and followed the beads to find the backpack of the cold atom device, but there's no trace of her mother nearby. On the other hand, Alice found the cabin that her mother had mentioned in the snowstorm. She turned her head excitedly to call her mother, but there was no one there. When she opened the door and went into the room, she found a ghost painting that she had never seen before hanging in the doorway. The ghost painting in the living room was still in its original place, and she picked up the tape recorder from the table and went upstairs. When she saw a bracelet hanging in the closet, the other Alice also came to the outside of the cabin. She saw the light in the window upstairs, thought it was her mother, and entered the cabin. At this point, the two Alices in the two worlds began to talk through the recording machine.
Alice, can you hear this? Alice, can you hear this? Alice? If you can hear this, say something. Hello?
During this time, Joe and Magnus also returned to their cabins in their respective worlds. Both heard their daughter's voice coming from upstairs and rushed up immediately.
Hello? Alice?
Are you in the cupboard? Yes.
I can't see you.
However, when Joe and Magnus opened the door of the wardrobe, there was only a recording machine turned on.
We're the same Alice? Don't know. Is there a mirror there? Yes. If you look in, I will too.
But when they closed the door of the closet, they found that both of them had been locked up again. I don't know if you've all understood, but time and space have become intertwined. The story isn't just about two parallel events. Their timelines are also different. Joe was terrified and rushed downstairs immediately, trying to save her daughter from the other cabin, but forgot to close the door. The wind blew the door shut, the vibration from which knocked over the oil lamp on the table, and a large fire began to spread throughout the room. Magnus also went outside and called for help from the police. However, he saw his daughter's footprints leading towards the frozen lake. He suspected that his daughter was contemplating suicide because of her mother's death. Meanwhile, the two Alices in the closet began to communicate about the different worlds through the mirror. Alice said that her mother in her world is dead, which shocked Joe, who was in the car with the recording machine searching for her daughter.
She's dead.
At that moment, she noticed a fire in the cabin behind her through her rearview mirror and turned the car around to go back. After getting out of the car,
Sorry. When did she die? She's still up there. Is your mama dead too? I think it's your mama and my mummy who died. I think they swapped places. Can I have her back?
Joe rushed into the flaming cabin to rescue her daughter, but the next second, it seemed as if she had entered another world. Only the paintings on the wall reflected the fire from the original world. She didn't understand what was happening but went upstairs following her daughter's cry for help. She finally found her daughter, Alice, in the closet. But this Alice wasn't her original daughter. Joe could hear the voice of the daughter from the other world from the recording machine, and she could also see her through the mirror in the closet. However, Alice couldn't hear her voice and could only communicate through the Alice of this world. At that time, the police snowplow had cleared the road. Henry and the others were looking for somebody at the frozen lake, but various scenes of another world began to appear in front of them.
Shut up. I'm coming to get you, Henry.
Henry was moving forward in the snowstorm holding the cold atom device when he suddenly saw a wooden house on fire in the distance. As he drew closer, more and more scenes appeared in front of him. Including him shooting Henry in the abdomen and panicking as he called the police. While Joe was halfway through a conversation with her daughter from the other world, the room suddenly turned into a sea of fire. It turned out that Alice had passed out due to smoke inhalation. She immediately grabbed her daughter and ran out of the fire. Just as she ran into Henry, who was hallucinating, and handed her daughter to him, Joe rushed back into the fiery scene to rescue her other daughter, but she couldn't find her anywhere in the thick smoke and fire. When Joe finally came to, she realized she was standing outside the cabin, not far away. Alice was lying on the ground and Henry was nowhere to be found. Joe noticed that her daughter had stopped breathing and started performing cardiopulmonary resuscitation, CPR, urgently. The other Alice behind her reminded her of something.
Come on!
I can't feel her anymore.
Okay. Come on! Come on!
I think she's dead.
At that moment, Magnus' shouts were heard from a distance. Joe told her daughter to go back to her father first.
But I'm your Alice.
Go to Papa, okay?
Jag älskar dig, mamma.
Jag älskar dig också.
As Alice turned around, she found herself back in her own world. Joe revived Alice, but when she turned to find her own daughter, she had disappeared. Alice was taken back to the cabin by Magnus, but he insisted that he hadn't seen her mother. She turned to look at the painting hanging by the door, which was different from what it had been before. After being rescued, Alice was taken to the hospital, but at night, she seemed to find herself in another dark world again. In the hospital room, a woman in Russian asked Alice in Russian if she wanted to see her mother. Surprisingly, it was the body of Irene, clad in a Russian spacesuit. Had Alice not been saved after all? Had she returned to a realm of the deceased? Joe was forcibly sent to a recovery center run by the European Space Agency, which was overseen by Irene of the Russian Federal Space Agency. In Joe's shocked gaze, Irene transformed into the body of the astronaut who had crashed into the space station. Meanwhile, as Joe started treatment, Henry woke up on an icy plane. He found the backpack carrying the cold atom device and took out the recorder and tapes from Joe's car. His two teammates who had originally stopped breathing in the spacecraft had somehow come back to life. After listening to all the tapes, Henry understood everything. Grabbing an axe, he approached the cold atom device and strenuously hacked it. He quickly smashed it to pieces, and for reasons unknown, perhaps due to the device being destroyed, the voices in the recording gradually faded. Joe, who was undergoing electroshock therapy in the sanatorium, fell unconscious. If you thought it was all over, you'd be mistaken. In another world, Henry was arrested by the police for shooting Paul. His hands were bloody, but he vehemently denied doing it. Instead, he claimed it was done by another person who looked just like him from the European Space Agency, and voluntarily agreed to a lie detector test. Henry successfully passed the test, but the DNA on the gun revealed that both DNAs were an exact match. A lie detector can only prove that you believe everything you say to be the truth. The police planned to charge him with murdering the host on the cruise ship, and attempted murder of Paul. In the sanatorium, during a physical checkup, it was discovered that Jo was pregnant, but the image from the instrument was strange. The doctor thought the instrument might have malfunctioned, but Irene was shocked when she saw the printed image. The following day, Jo woke up and was taken to Irene's office. She was informed that her daughter, Alice, was safe, but if her condition remained untreated, it would worsen. Jo now understood the facts about parallel time-space. Her cherished daughter was not in this world. She longed to find her genuine daughter. Irene informed her that she was pregnant. They always conduct a pregnancy test before prescribing lithium to patients as it can severely affect the health of the fetus. Jo's condition required a dosage of 1,800 milligrams of lithium, but she was still in the early stages of pregnancy, and the child was merely a month old. Thus, doctors devised alternative medical therapy to treat her condition. However, this required Jo to strictly adhere to the treatment plan, otherwise, she would need electrotherapy. An eerie sound resonated from upstairs. Irene explained it was coming from another patient in irredeemable case. Jo finally recognized Irene from the corpse of the astronaut who had crashed into the space station. She began to recite in Russian, the last words she had heard from the tape recording of Irene's final moments. Irene, in panic, fled from the office. She shortly dialed Henry's number to arrange a meeting. Soon, her colleague Ilya from the Union space station came to visit Jo. Ilya identified that Jo was afflicted with astronaut overwork syndrome. Patients would feel at odds with their environment and become suspicious. They would think familiar places and people were fake. Many astronauts have suffered from this. The good news was that the condition could be cured. Irene was terminally ill with cancer, and Ilya would take over her position after her. Strangers could hardly believe what Jo said. People would naturally trust what they could see. Jo mentioned that Irene was in charge of the Russian Federal Space Agency, but she had absolutely no recollection of her. She drew a blank at the mention of the cold atom experiment. Henry, and even her own daughter, outraged, Jo forced Ilya to leave, but before departing, Ilya urged her to comply with the medication routine. However, she subtly handed something to Jo, casting an upstairs glance before leaving. In the meantime, Magnus took Alice home. He too had been seeing a psychologist. For once, during a snowy night, he too had seemed to see his deceased wife. Alice still insisted that her mother was alive. Magnus felt that both mother and daughter were undergoing events he couldn't comprehend. They had a secret he wasn't privy to. He felt stuck and didn't know how to help his daughter move forward. There were two Magnus from two different worlds. One thought his wife was dead. The other thought she had gone mad. Henry, dressed in a suit, kept his appointment. By now, having heard the tapes, he understood everything. The world's original Irene suffocated to death due to a fire in the spacecraft. Both he and Irene imagined they were suffering from astronaut overwork syndrome. Both had experienced accidents in space and felt out of place after returning. Henry took out the pill bottle and questioned whether starting to take these pills now could alleviate his mild personality disorder. Irene assumed it was caused by not taking medication and wanted to take him to a monastery for treatment, but Henry declined her offer. Presently, the monastery was dark. Jo carefully unlocked the door and went upstairs. There was a room from which came the eerie yells of a man. Following the echoes, she arrived at the door and glanced through a small window. Inside were two identical old men, repeatedly calling for their mother. In Jo's original world, Magnus decided to move away from the heartbreaking home with his daughter. As Alice was packing, she saw the recorder again. It was her farewell with the other Alice from another world. When she mentioned wanting to hear her mother's voice again, the other Alice fell silent. As they were leaving, Alice told her father that she had given up looking for her mother in the world where her mother lived. Another Alice existed. Alice had accepted fate.
You're incredibly brave.
But Jo still refused to take her medicine. Upon meeting Irene, she inquired about the two men locked in the upstairs room. Irene urged her to stop overthinking and focus on her medication. Otherwise, she'd eventually have a mental breakdown.
Did I die up there?
Irene didn't answer these questions, believing that understanding these things wouldn't help Jo. Jo was now a mother. She needed to accept this fact. regardless of the truth. It was something that had already happened. Joe could never change it. She hoped to live happily in this world. Soon, Magnus and Alice visited her. Alice told her mother that the Alice from the other world had adjusted and wouldn't mind her staying in this world. They had both lost a loved one, but they also found another. This doesn't mean we need to forget each other. It only means we need to accept the facts.
I need a mummy.
I need an Alice.
Alice's words stirred up a mix of emotions in Joe. Joe admitted the reality that she could not return, and confided in her husband, Magnus. This wasn't the world she had left, but she decided to start taking those pills. As long as she could go home and be with them, it was okay. The two decided to have the baby. What Joe didn't know was that the ultrasound scan of her 1-month-old fetus showed 2 sets of images, just like the results of the cold ion experiment. After much deliberation, Irene decided to disclose the secret of astronauts before dying of cancer. She drafted an email to everyone at the European Space Agency. In 1967, I became the second woman to venture into outer space. I carried a responsibility to suppress a major truth about space travel that it can drive people insane. We all pretended it didn't happen, she wrote.
I'm asking whether you might be willing to report any of your own issues anonymously to me.
At the same time, Paul woke up in the hospital. Magnus had already packed the luggage into the car, ready to leave with his wife and daughter. Joe, who had agreed to take her medicine in the monastery, was preparing to go home with her husband and daughter. At departure, Alice asked her mother a question which was difficult to answer.
If what happened, happened. If I'm from here, and Daddy's from here, and you're from there, where's the baby gonna be from?
Simultaneously, within the Union Space Station in space, Joe's voice still echoed on a tablet. It was the recording of her yearning for her daughter when she was stranded alone on the space station, trying to fix a battery and lost contact with Earth. Joe, who had turned around, had half her face disappeared. It turned out that the person who resolved the lifeboat bolt in the space station was the Joe who had died in this world originally.